long time since I've made any kind of video for my writing YouTube channel. But I'm hoping to get back into making them more regularly, and to start with, I have a video that I wanted to make to explain something that I kind of created on a whim last night and finished up today. And to be honest, it made me feel like a little bit of a crazy person, because what I ended up producing looks like something, it looks a little bit crazy, but I promise it makes sense. So the purpose of this video is to explain it, and I am also going to write a blog post explaining it, and the blog post will have a link to the PDF, the printable that goes with this, along with all the images that I show in this video. So if you find this helpful, if it seems like something you might want to use, all the resources will be there in the blog post, which I'll link below. So anyway, what I'm talking about tonight is something that I am calling the plot onion. So some of you, if you follow my blog at all, you might know that a year or two ago I created this series, this blog post series about plotting. And it was all about plotting out a story that's going to keep your reader captivated, keep them turning the pages. It was a very linear plotting method, and it's still a method that I think works. It was kind of a mashup, or like a takeaway of several different plotting methods, which I talk about in the blog post series. None of these are original ideas just from me. These are ideas gleaned from many other very smart people. Some of the ideas go all the way back to Aristotle, like very well thought out, long time used plotting methods and plotting concepts. However, each person, each author who has written on these concepts or developed these concepts has kind of given them their own terminology, or put their own spin on them, or kind of emphasized different things. So what I did in my previous blog series is just kind of explain how, in my mind, when I was teaching the novel writing class to high schoolers, how in my mind all of these things fit together, and how I taught them to my students as kind of as a whole, where everything fits together. But again, it was a very linear method. So the plot onion is an attempt to make something that is a little bit more visually helpful for people who are more visual. And because the linear method is great, but the one downside that I found to it is that when you get into a really complicated story, it can become difficult to hold the entire story in your mind while you're writing. And my outlines, even when I'm using the method that I talked about in the other blog post series, my outlines will kind of like sprawl into pages and pages and pages. And then I have to flip through to try to find and try to hold the story in my mind. So then I usually condense that down to kind of like a 1-page beat sheet that just has sort of like bullet points, and I work off of that, and then I refer to the longer outline. And so the plot onion, the goal of the plot onion is to sort of take all of that and represent it visually, but following one very important concept that wasn't addressed in my other blog post, and that is the fact that stories are circular. So a lot of plotting methods are linear, outline based, but there are some really cool plotting methods that focus on the fact that a story is circular. So you start at one point, and essentially your character follows the arc around, and they kind of come full circle. A lot of stories will actually literally bring them back to the same location they started at, but where you're able to see the contrast of how the character changed during the course of the story. So plotting circularly can be really powerful because you can set up that character arc in a way that really makes it feel satisfying and thematically deep, and it has that resonance and it has that impact for the reader. So I've been reading a lot about circular story plots and watching a lot, and again, I'm gleaning from several people. So before I show you my plot onion, I want to go through just very quickly sort of the sources of this, because the plot onion doesn't make sense without all of these. So essentially what I started with, and I'm going to just put these up here. This was my last night at 11 o'clock at night. I just suddenly went, oh my goodness, I think I could mash all these together, and I started drawing them out. So this top one here is called the plot embryo, and again, these are the story plotting methods that I drew from. So I did not create these, so I'm going to explain where I got each of them. So this is Dan Harmon's plot embryo up here. If you haven't looked into the plot embryo, it's a really, really cool one, but I use it as part of my plot onion. So again, all of these that I'm going to go through right here, what I tried to do is kind of layer them, that's why it's called a plot onion, in a way that you could at one glance kind of remind yourself, pick and choose what applies to this story, and then plot it all on one page. That's the goal, is to have like a one page at a glance outline. And that's what the plot embryo is really good at, because if you look here, you start here and it moves clockwise. So you would start with the character in a zone of comfort, that's you. Need, go, search, find, take, return, change. So as you move around the circle, the character wants something, they enter an unfamiliar situation, they adapt to that situation, they get what they wanted, but it comes at a heavy price, they return to their familiar situation having changed. And then on the inside part, this is just showing that the top half of the circle is the familiar world for the character. So you start in it and you also end in it. And the bottom half is unfamiliar world. So as you move into the problem of the story, you're entering that unfamiliar world and you're in it up until the end when you return. But when you return, on this half the character was ignorant, on this half the character has learned. So when you return to the familiar, the character has changed, and you're able to show that really well in this sort of full circle method. And then when you use the plot embryo, what you do is you put this right in the middle of the page, and you draw these lines out all the way to the ends of the page, and then you literally can just bullet point, kind of very briefly summarize what you're going to do for each section, and have your whole plot on one page, and it's beautiful. This is a method that I've been kind of playing around with for my own stories, but there were some other plotting structures that I really liked as well. So I wanted to take this concept of the plot embryo and kind of blend some other structures into them, some of which were already created in a circular fashion, and other ones I turned circular to be able to overlay or to layer them with this. So the second one is actually from a TED Talk. It was from Tomas Puyo, and it's called the Story Plotting Mirror Circle. And there's an excellent TED Talk where he goes through this whole thing and explains it in terms of plotting stories, but also for business people when you're writing ad copy or telling your story to an audience when you're a public speaker. This applies to all of them. So, and his moves counterclockwise. So it's the initial situation, the problem, you explore the problem, you have a midpoint insight, you explore the solution, you have the solution, and you have the aftermath. But what's important to know about his is that if you were to divide the circle in half, everything on this side mirrors everything on that side. So the problem and the solution are scenes that are going to mirror each other, sometimes very literally. So they could be a situation where you're in the same location, you have the same kind of scenario, but where the problem was introduced in the first part, toward the end of the story, you'll have the same basic scene. The character will return to the same place, have a similar scenario, but the solution will emerge. And you do the same, you mirror all your scenes all the way down. On this side, exploring the problem, but then mirroring them, exploring the solution on your way up to the solution. And the midpoint is where the character has some sort of major realization. So this concept of mirroring, I first got from his TED Talk. Then, this was a strange coincidence. Very soon after I saw that TED Talk, K.M. Whalen, who is an author that I've been reading her blog and her website and her books for some time. She has an excellent collection of books on plotting. She's usually approached plotting very linearly. But she just recently started doing a blog post series where she is taking her linear plot structure and she's turning it circular, which I thought was a really interesting coincidence for the timing of that. Since this is when I was looking at all these circular plot structures, and suddenly hers is circular. So this is just my hand-drawn version of what she puts on her site. So this is her plot circle. And again, she goes counterclockwise on hers. When I layer these, I'm going to make sure they all go the same direction. So, don't worry about that. But the hook, the inciting event, the first plot point, which is the point of no return, the first pinch point, which is the reminder of the antagonist's power and new clues about the conflict. Then you have the midpoint, which is the second plot point. Then you have the second pinch point, which foreshadows the third plot point and reminds the protagonist of what's at stake. Then you have the third plot point, which is the dark moment or all is lost, the climax and the resolution. And again, in her plot circle, she's saying that the ones on either side are connected. So similar to the mirror circle that I just showed you, the inciting event is going to be intrinsically connected to the climax. So whatever it is that kicks off the conflict of the story, it just makes sense that you're going to have a natural connection between that and the climax, because that's where the conflict gets solved, right? And the first plot point is going to be naturally connected to the third plot point. The pinch points are going to be naturally connected to each other. And so if you plot circularly like this, you can make sure that those connections are really, really solid, which is going to give your story a really cool thematic depth and a really interesting solid feel to it. It's going to feel like everything clicks together, theoretically. So this is hers. Then the other ones that I wanted to mash in with these that are not naturally circular are Orson Scott Card's Mice Quotient. This is a really cool concept that I, for some reason, just discovered, a few months ago, even though it's been around a very long time. And I really respect him as an author and as a writing instructor. I've watched some instructional videos and done a free workshop. And so I was really intrigued to explore this further, but basically his premise for this is that there are 4 types of stories, and I'm going to butcher this word, but it's like a milieu, a location, a setting story. Or an idea or inquiry story, a character story, or an event story. So M-I-C-E, mice. Those are the 4 types of stories you can have. The setting story begins when a character leaves a familiar place and goes to an unfamiliar one. And it ends when the character returns to the familiar, usually. An idea story begins with a question and it ends when the question is answered. A character story begins with a character who is unhappy or unsatisfied in some way, and it ends when they either change their circumstances or accept them. And then an event story begins with some sort of disastrous event, and it ends when that event is resolved or when everyone dies. So these are the 4 types of story. When you have a novel, there are sufficient layers of plotting that you could have all 4, but you are going to start with whichever one is most interesting or the strongest for your story. The concept of the Mice Quotient is that you open these things, the milieu, the idea, the character, the event, you open them in the order of relevance or importance or strength for your story, but then you have to close them in the reverse order. So essentially it's like nesting code, or my friend explained it when I was talking to her today. She's like, oh, it's like Russian nesting dolls. So essentially if you start with the milieu, then you have to, if you do M-I-C-E or M-C-I-E, whatever order you go in, you have to close them in the opposite order, so E-C-I-M, okay? So the example, there was a podcast that I listened to recently where they talked about this, and it's the Writing Excuses podcast. It's really great. If you want to look it up, it goes into this particular plotting method way more in depth. But they go through how this fits together, and they use the Wizard of Oz as an example. So the Wizard of Oz starts as a character story. Dorothy is unhappy with her life, with where she is. She wants to get away. And then there is an event, the tornado, which whisks her off to another world. So that's the milieu. I'm terrible with that word. And then once she's in Oz, there is the idea or the inquiry, which is, how do I get home? And she finds out that there's this wizard, and like, who is this wizard? What can he help us get home? So there's the question raised. So the story follows those pretty systematically, and then at the end, when everything is wrapping up, it closes them in the reverse order. So they find out who the wizard is. They find out that the ruby slippers are how she gets home. So that answers the question. She's transported home, and so that closes out the setting. She's back in her familiar place. And then the event is just wrapping up because she wakes up just as the tornado has passed, right? So the event is closed. And then the very next thing, the final thing to close, is her character arc, which is that she is now content to be home and realizes there's no place like home. So they opened them and then they closed them in the reverse order. This is the Mice quotient. So it can help you figure out where to end your story based on what you opened with, so that you're not ending it too soon and leaving things unresolved, or ending it too late where like you really already resolved the main issue and you're just dragging things out. This can help you figure that out. So it's really, really helpful. So when I made the plot onion, I put this in there, but I turned it into circular because it already kind of is. Like, you open them all and then you close them all. So I drew it out that way, and I'll show you in a minute. And then the last layer of the onion, and I actually put this deeper inside the onion. It's not on the outside, but this is one of the last one I'm going to show you guys. This is Blake Snyder's beat sheet. Now, his original beat sheet is linear, and it is a screenwriting. It's for screenwriters, but it's really helpful also for plotting novels. And essentially, there are 15 points, 15 beats. And they are the opening image, theme stated, setup, catalyst, debate, act 2, B story, fun and games, midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost, black moment, act 3, finale, and final image. If you want to know more about the beat sheet, his book, Save the Cat, is really, really fabulous. And I'm not a screenwriter, but it was very helpful for me even as a novelist, as an author. But one important thing about his beat sheet is that it gives like the exact breakdown of where these occur in a typical movie. And the placement is important. The pacing is very important in order for it to feel satisfying to the viewer or to the reader if you're using this for a novel. And so I took the percentages of like, this occurs 5% into the book, this occurs from 1 to 10%, this occurs at 25%. So I took those and I essentially just made them into a circle. So it was not a circular plotting system at first, but I made it into a circle. So it starts here and I made it go clockwise. So you have the opening image, the setup goes from 1 to 10%, the catalyst is right around there, then this is the debate period, then this is the start of Act 2 where the change of playing field, then the B story comes in right after that at about 27%, and then this whole section from 25 to 50 is fun and games. There's the midpoint, which is where the stakes are raised, there's a false peak or a false collapse. Then from 25 to about 70 is the bad guys close in. Then right at 70-ish% is all is lost, which is where the old way of thinking dies and it seems like there's no hope. Then there's the black moment, and then at 75%, Act 3 begins, and this is where the A story and the B story, which came in here, the B story is like usually a side plot that carries the theme of the story. Here, where the start of Act 3, the A and B story combine to reveal a solution. And so then there's the finale that leads up, and then the final image, which is going to mirror the opening image with the contrast showing how much things have changed since the beginning. And so then, of course, this follows the basic 3-act structure. This would be essentially Act 1. This is Act 2. This is Act 3. If you prefer the 4-act structure where you divide this into even acts, then this would be Act 1, 2, 3, 4. I usually just use the typical 3-act structure, even though Act 2 is essentially 50% of your story. This is 25, and this is the last 25. So I just took his linear beat sheet and I turned it into a circle so that I could layer these. So if I still have you and I haven't lost you yet, then maybe you won't think I'm absolutely insane when I show you what I created. So this is my plot onion. And I'm going to bring it up close. It really is easier to read like in person. You can see everything up close. I know it looks crazy and everything is tiny. But essentially, since I've explained all the parts, this is really easy to explain now. So this inside is the plot embryo. I basically just did like my own explanation version of the plot embryo. I put it here in the center. The pink ring around it is K.M. Whalen's plot circle. The blue ring around that is the plotting mirror circle from that TED Talk that I told you about. This purple circle around the edge is Blake Snyder's beat sheet. I put the axe around so you could see. And again, when I did this, I made everything move clockwise just so it would make sense. And then this is the mice quotient ring out on the outside. It just reminds you that you're going to open mice 1, open mice 2, open mice 3, open mice 4. Then you're going to close 4, close 3, close 2, close 1. And because the order of the mice and like what each story has might be different, I put boxes where you could write it in. So not every story might have all 4, or if you do have all 4, some stories are primarily a character story. They're going to start with the character. Some would start with the event. So these boxes are for you to like jot that in, just to keep track of where you're opening each of those mice, and then to make sure that you plan to close them. And then these lines are drawn out. So essentially how you would use this is this whole center section is just for reference. And you would kind of look at this, and these lines draw all the way out from the plot embryo that are in the center. So essentially you could just use the plot embryo, or you could use one of the other rings that are out like on the outside, or you could kind of look at all of them and decide what you're going to do with a combination of those. Essentially, I created this to where visually you can see all the different plotting structures in one glance, and then just kind of look at them and then jot your plan for the story in the sections above it. So essentially, if you were following the plot embryo and you had 8 sections, you could jot like bullet point what's going to happen in each part. If you just want to focus on the acts, this gives you kind of the tent pole of Act 1, which is going to be your inciting event. So this would be your setup phase. This would be everything between the inciting event and the start of Act 2. So you can use as many of the rings as you want to, or you could just ignore the rings that don't apply to this story or that you just don't really feel are helpful. But I know for me, when I'm plotting stories, sometimes my plotting, my ideas of the story actually kind of go in layers. So I may start with a plot embryo and a simplified concept, but then I may want to look more closely at it or kind of layer on some of these more specific things like the first plot point, the inciting event, and make sure that all of those are there. And so this kind of provides a visual for you to have it all on one page, as kind of a cheat sheet for remembering your story and being able to kind of hold it all in your mind at one glance. Probably you're going to want additional pages to give more detail because you only are going to have room to write like very basic notes here. But my hope is that this might be helpful for kind of consolidating your plot into one visual representation that you can just put up on the wall or keep on your desk or keep in your notebook and just glance at to keep yourself on track and to kind of remind yourself where you are in the story. If you're not a plotter, I probably seem like an absolutely crazy person right now. So if that's the case, then you can still, read my blog post. It's going to go through what I've just explained. Download the printable if you think it's going to be useful, and only use what is helpful to you or keep it as a reference. Or a lot of times for pantsers or people who don't plot ahead, this can be helpful in editing. So you could use this to look back and make sure that the structure of your story, if you feel like something is off and you can't quite figure out what, you could refer to this to see if maybe it's one of these elements that are out of place. There is a lovely lady who does a series on YouTube about the plot embryo. She didn't create the plot embryo. That was Dan Harmon. But she does. She didn't create the plot embryo. That was Dan Harmon, but she does a really lovely series of videos where she takes the plot embryo and she analyzes movies and other stories to show where those stories went wrong and how the plot embryo could have fixed them. So if you're not a plotter, that might be one application that you could use with this crazy plot onion that I made. So if you don't think I'm crazy and you'd like more writing videos, you can subscribe, follow me, click the notifications so you can see when I do new videos. Please also check out my blog. You can follow me there. You can subscribe to my newsletter. And I'm hoping to have more writing tips out for you guys. I promise they will not all be as crazy as this one. All right, thank you.